So thank you to everyone who is here today. We're going to do a webinar on Bill 88. So my name is Andrew Pariser. I'm the VP of ResCon. Thank you to everyone for attending. This event is in cooperation with ResCon and all of ORCA. So that is a collection of the builders, as well as the residential subtrades, as well as some infrastructure related subtrades. We are honored to be joined by two top lawyers from Sherrard Coos, and Ahed's going to introduce them, and then Mark Barnes, who is a leader in substance abuse and also is a leader when it comes to naloxone, is going to do a presentation. So Bill 88, which is known as Working for Workers Act, is an omnibus bill that focused on various pieces of employment legislation. And so we're going to specifically focus on three main parts that are going to impact you as members, you as the construction industry. So those three parts are the right to disconnect, the naloxone kits and requirements related to that, and then increased fines and fees. And so the first part is obviously going to be a legal presentation, and the second part will be what I'll call more of a practical presentation from Mark. In addition, we are working on two templates that we'll make available in the near future. One is going to focus on the right to disconnect, and then the second one will focus on naloxone. And so the reason why we don't want to give you a temp or a policy is because we want you as an employer to take the template and make the practical changes that you need to make so that it's meaningful for your site. When you're talking about health and safety issues, as an employer, you have very specific obligations. As a builder or a constructor, you have very specific obligations. Taking a policy and photocopying it and putting it on your site will not meet those obligations, and so we will not be giving you that. We will give you a template, and then you can reach out to, Brian, Louisa, someone else at Sherrard Coos, and I already mispronounced Sherrard again, so I'll have to work on that. But the idea is to take the template and to use it to make a policy that reflects your specific needs in your workplaces. In addition to that, there's a lot of people who meet with the government on this webinar, and what's important is we need to make sure that construction is recognized as unique. And so it doesn't matter which piece of employment legislation it is, whether it's the Ontario Labour Relations Act, whether it's the Employment Standards Act or other pieces, construction is a unique sector of the economy. Sometimes, the sectors of construction are treated uniquely. I think we all know coming out of the strikes that there's specific legislation for bargaining and residential construction. And so we want to make sure that the government, when they pass laws and bills going forward, are treating construction distinct and separate instead of looping us into omnibus legislation. And so we would like to be dealt differently in construction than the rest of the economy. We have a track record of that. And so that's just something that we'll ask all members, all other groups to advocate for. We don't want this one size fits all employment legislation. We want specific legislation that takes into account the practical realities that we face in construction. So with that, I'm going to do a quick land acknowledgement, and then we're going to turn it over to Ahed, who is going to introduce our first speakers. And so we respectfully acknowledge that we are situated on traditional territories and treaty lands. In particular, those of the Mississauga of the New Credit First Nation, as well as the Anishinaabe of the Williams Treaty First Nation, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis Nation. As ResCon's office is located in Vaughan, we are grateful to have the opportunity to work and live in this territory. And with that, I will pass it over to Ahed.
Hey everyone, I'm Ahed. I'm the Policy and Programs Analyst at ResCon. Today we have Louisa Vichnovich. Louisa advises, represents, and advocates for employers in many areas of employment and labor law. She began her career with Sherrard Coos LLP as a law student, during which time she participated in secondment with the Ontario Labour Relations Board. Louisa is a member of the Law Society of Ontario, Canadian Bar Association, and Ontario Bar Association, Civil Liberties and Human Rights, Workers' Compensation, and Youth Lawyers. We also have Brian Wasilou. Brian is an experienced and accomplished employment and labor lawyer with a background in commercial litigation. He has extensive courtroom experience, having appeared at all levels of court in Ontario and before many administrative tribunals. Brian's expertise includes the full range of employment and labor law with a particular focus on employment contracts, wrongful and constructive dismissal, non-competition and non-solicitation, injunctive relief, grief, arbitration, employment and labor issues, and corporate restructuring and transactions, and human rights and accommodation. And he's also published on a variety of labor and employment issues. Brian and Louisa, we're really happy to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to hear everything you have to say.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. We're happy to be here. And Louisa, if you could throw up the presentation, we'll take everyone through it. As was mentioned, Louisa and I are with Shared Coos, and we're management side labor and employment lawyers. So that's obviously the assistance we provide and hope to be helpful. Specifically, again, as was mentioned, we're focusing on some of the recent changes to the law that will be of interest to you. And so, Louisa, if you can advance the agenda. Specifically, there were changes through the recent Bill 88 and Bill 27. You've probably heard some information about the disconnecting from work. That's actually an area exactly to the point that Andrew raised, where there hasn't been, as of yet, any distinction to treat construction companies any differently from anyone else. So Louisa will walk you through some of the important pieces from that perspective, and then I will focus on some changes to the Occupational Health and Safety Act, and specifically two changes. First, an adjustment to the penalties and the timelines for prosecutions in the event of workplace accidents or failures. And then secondly, this issue of naloxone kits and requirement for employers to have those present. So with that, I will let Louisa take over and talk about disconnecting from work.
Great, thank you, Brian. So hi, everyone. As Brian mentioned, my name is Louisa. I'm very happy to be here today. And I'll be covering one of the changes to the Employment Standards Act as a result of the Working for Workers legislation. And specifically, it's the requirement for certain employers to have a disconnecting from work policy in place. If you haven't already implemented this policy and you're wondering whether as an employer you're required to have this policy in place, the key question you'll want to ask is whether as of January 1st of this year, you had 25 or more employees. If the answer to that question is yes, then you'll be required to have a policy in place that's effective as of June 2nd, so earlier this month. And it's important to note that that's an ongoing obligation. So if you're not yet in that category of employers that qualifies, but let's say you have 25 or more employees as of January 1st of next year, you'll be required to then implement that policy by March of 2023. So if you are in that category of employers that needs to have this policy in place and you're wondering, well, what does disconnecting from work mean? You're certainly not alone. Disconnecting from work, one of the biggest driving forces behind this change was actually coming out of the pandemic, where many of us have seen the lines blurred between home and work life more than ever before. Certainly some of us are no strangers to taking Zoom calls or Teams calls from our kitchen or dining tables while juggling family care obligations. So this was kind of the background and the context behind this change. But the legislation itself provides a definition of disconnecting from work, which can basically be summarized as being free from the performance of work. Specifically work-related communication. So whether that's taking phone calls, reviewing emails or text messages, these are all things that the legislation has kind of captured under that definition. And it's important to note that this policy will be required to apply to all employees, not just certain kinds. So that includes your managers, your supervisors as well. You know, Andrew had actually mentioned it earlier, and it's certainly, I'm going to echo it because it's right. There's no one size fits all approach here. The legislation really did recognize that. So when it comes to kind of what the legislation actually requires the policy to have, it's quite sparse. So the policy must include the date that it was prepared and the dates of any subsequent amendments. Once the policy is prepared, there's certain document and retention obligations that an employer has. So once that policy is created, you'll want to give a copy of that policy to your employees within 30 days of its creation, to any new hire within 30 days of their hire. And you'll also want to keep track of any expired versions of that policy for at least 3 years after the policy ceases to be in effect. The key thing to note here is that there's also this door that's been left open Specifically, the government has included the fact that the policy needs to include such information as may be prescribed. So currently this is what we have, but certainly in the future, there may be more things that get added on. So for the time being, what does this actually mean for you as an employer? What do you need to do with this policy? How do you adapt it to your organization? So the key thing that helps the conversation is thinking about transparency in your workplace. The disconnecting from work policy requirement isn't actually changing anything with respect to the Employment Standards Act and the current hours of work obligations that your existing workforce has, including the fact that, for instance, your supervisors may still be working additional hours and not entitled to overtime and things like that. So that has not changed. But what's helpful to think about it as is in terms of transparency over, okay, within my organization, what kinds of employees do I have? What are the hours of work or the standard, quote unquote, hours of work that my supervisors might have versus, my workers that are on the ground, on projects, on construction sites. Thinking through that and trying to address it in advance so that you're transparent with your workforce about when they might be expected to be on the clock versus off the clock. And what we've done here is we've kind of compiled a list of all the things to help drive that conversation for you within your organization. And it really helps to think about logistically and procedurally, what are some of the challenges in the construction industry that we see all the time? And oftentimes that can be things like time itself, right? When we're thinking about, let's say, low-rise residential construction projects, right? You're very much at the whim of weather conditions and whether or not you're, I know some of us have seen material shortages during the pandemic, right? And if things are delayed and certain trades are coming on site later than scheduled and it's forcing delays for other trades, how do we anticipate the kinds of logistical challenges that usually come up within your organization? And how can we at least manage employees' expectations within those circumstances when they might be expected to work, again, quote unquote, off the clock? Those are the kinds of things that you'll want to account for and think about how to tailor within your policy itself. One key thing to really note here about the Employment Standards Act, because there's certainly a lot of hype and a lot of buzz in the media about disconnecting from work. This has sometimes been misstated as a change that creates a right to disconnect from work. And we want to be mindful of that language and avoid it, because really what the legislation is doing is it's creating a requirement to implement a policy that addresses disconnecting from work. And it's an important and subtle nuance, because we want to avoid having anything that creates additional rights where there are none, if that's not the intention of the organization. So just being mindful again about what that policy is capturing and making sure that it's honoring whatever your intentions are as a company. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Brian, who is now going to be taking us through some of the changes from the Working for Workers legislation to the Occupational Health and Safety Act.
Yes, thank you, Louisa. And just quickly, most of you might be following in the chat, but just a few things, housekeeping that weren't mentioned. This PowerPoint will be provided available after the presentation, and Andrew has indicated ResCon will also be posting the recording of this to their website. And also, if you have any questions, you can type them into the chat. We'll sort of take questions at the end of the slide deck. So with that out of the way, I wanted to talk about a few things from the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And specifically, we'll start with some of the changes to the penalties and the timelines under the Act. And some of you might not give a lot of thought to this, but it's potentially significant. It signals a change that I think has been sort of happening. It's not a recent thing. The phrasing that we see a lot as lawyers is sort of an internal responsibility system, and this concept that everyone in the job site or on the job site or in the workplace has responsibilities. And as Andrew sort of alluded to, you could envision that as, the workers themselves are required to be safe and to notify if they see hazards. And then it goes up from there, and the supervisors are charged with making sure that their workers know the standards, and also reporting themselves, but also then doing something about the hazards. And it just goes up from there to the employer, and then you have the constructor, and that could take on a whole life of its own and a whole other presentation. But for the point now that I wanted to drive home is that they have made changes, and it's sort of buttressing that concept of, attaching individual responsibility when accidents happen, so that nobody can blame the other person exclusively or just delegate responsibilities without giving a thought to the buck stopping with them, so to speak. Even though the buck doesn't stop with them, it keeps going up the chain as far as they can go. Anyways, the long and the short of it is that we have significant increases to the fine amounts that can be applied for violations under OSHA. You can see there for directors or officers of corporations that the fines are now moved from $100,000 to $1.5 million potentially, and for individuals, so supervisors, that sort of level of responsibility increased from $100,000 to $500,000. And in addition, that penalty is a maximum penalty per offense. So we haven't started to see, obviously, any decisions that have made these significant jumps yet, but that direction is there. And it's a bit of an inducement to consider that sort of deterrent effect, a punishment effect. And I'll come back to that in a moment, if Louisa can. Yeah, perfect. The other thing that's important to note is that these new changes don't apply to offenses or situations that have already occurred prior to July 1st, okay, whether the charges were there or not. If the events that give rise to the charges occurred before July 1st, then those new fine levels don't apply. But again, the second bullet there is that this is all designed to reinforce the important role that everybody has in this responsibility system, all the way up to the directors and officers who can't simply just delegate the responsibility. You have to be aware of it. And the equivalent would be a director making sure that the company that they sit on the board for has all their vacation pay paid up. Otherwise, it could actually come back on them, right? So the other thing is that part and parcel of increasing those fines and deterring people, there's specific codification of what's really been in the law from the cases, aggravating factors, right? So if there was a death or serious injury, then that can be considered to actually increase the fine. The thing that you did or did not do, that sort of culpability, may not matter. That can be just you could have a more significant outcome and fine just because of the consequence was so significant. However, the thing that you did or did not do, i.e., were you reckless, were you morally blameworthy? Like, did you know that there was a problem, but you didn't do anything about it because you're the one who should have been watching it all along? And oh, just one more week, what are the chances something bad's going to happen? So look, give it turning a blind eye, right? A lack of remorse when it does happen. Any of those items are now, it's okay, Louisa. Any of those items are aggravating factors that will you're essentially directed to consider when determining the outcome, the fine or the consequences. The other thing is that the timeline for bringing charges is extended. It used to be 1 year. Now it's 2 years. And any of you who have some involvement in this area know that it was the habit of the ministry to wait until just before the 1 year period. I expect that they're probably going to wait even longer now, up to the 2 year period, just before that, before you actually find out what's going to be moved on or not. And for those reasons, again, it's crucial that your own company creates or does its own investigation to capture any witness information or evidence in that moment instead of it going stale over the next year, year and a half, 2 years even. So that's vitally important. And again, shameless plug here that we do a lot of that. If you find yourself in that unfortunate circumstance, you always have an opportunity to reach out to us for help because we would be happy to help. And Louise, if you can advance the slide. Sorry, we're jumping to the next topic, but so that was the important pieces of the changes to both fine levels and timelines, just something to sort of be aware of, but the substance in terms of responsibilities hasn't inherently changed. Substance and change is what we're talking about in the next topic in terms of the naloxone kit. A lot of people have been talking about this, and it's really great that we're going to have Mark Barnes at ResCon was able to bring him over to, because I can't wait to hear from him in terms of some of the more specific issues around the naloxone kit. I may hack at that a little bit, and I apologize. He's thankfully here to clean up any mistakes I make. The changes here, I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have already heard about this. And the basic concept is to have a naloxone kit on standby with someone who knows how to use it if there is a risk, or you should be reasonably aware that there's a risk of a worker having an opioid overdose in the workplace. Okay, it's not yet been proclaimed. Government has to come into place and get all settled in. What I'm hearing, what we're hearing, is late summer at this point. There is some motivation, obviously, to get support available, training modules for employers to actually get the kits out. I mean, you can get them now at pharmacies, and you can get some training at those pharmacies. But I think the idea is to actually have a more substantive process for employers to be able to get these kits, give them to their people, and get their people trained on how to use them before this requirement comes into play. The kit itself, you've probably heard a lot about it. It's a pouch. It has the antidote to help with someone who is apparently suffering from an overdose. Part of the training is to how to recognize that, either injection or I think a spray in the nose. Again, thankfully Mark's here, may be able to help us with that. And this is to help potentially save someone's life. Now, it becomes important, particularly for the construction industry, because as I indicated before, it's again one of these areas where you have this very helpful, and I do say that sarcastically, legal concept of you're aware that there's a reasonable likelihood of someone having an overdose, or you should be aware. That's not very clear, some might say. There's nothing specifically naming the construction industry in the legislation. But if you do know, or I'm telling you now, there was a lot of talk about the construction industry as this change was rolled out. So you see some stats there about the number of opioid-related deaths, overdose deaths from workers in the workplace in the past few years. And what I think is getting airtime and is notable is that was something like almost 1 in 3, or about 30% of those overdoses were people employed in the construction industry. So the idea is that there are demographics that seem to have this higher risk of overdose situations: nightclubs, bars, and the construction industry, right? Or a workplace with a history of an overdose. And next slide, Louisa. So what does that mean? I mean, that essentially means, I think, if you're risk adverse, you consider any construction site to be a place where there's an existing sort of red flag about potential overdose, strictly based on the demographic information, again, that the government has wrapped all of this up in. The responsibility then is to make sure that the naloxone kit is there, and there's someone who knows how to get it, find it, get it, use it when they recognize an opioid overdose, and recognize the hazards of administering naloxone. And again, Mark can help us with that, to the worker who has apparently suffered the overdose. And in terms of, sort of a more practical look at how you might do this, I mean, in some respects, it doesn't have to be, frankly, that disruptive. Assuming structure and support in terms of provision of kits and provision of training on how to use them, one would think that the person responsible at your site for administering first aid is the right person to get that training and be ready. That the naloxone kit goes in your first aid kit that you have on the job site. That discussions about its presence and or who to get help from if something happens, which are probably already part of your toolbox talks or whatever kind of discussions a foreman or supervisor might have with the workers on the job site. And that's, I think, the spot to integrate it. We also can talk about revisions to policies or updating to policies, but I think there can be a lot of immediate reaction because people aren't too sure about what exactly it means. But on the whole, it might not be as big of a change as I think people are really concerned about in terms of a kit to go in your first aid kit. And yes, there's additional requirements around training to make sure someone knows how to use it. But that seems to, in some respects, make sense. I think the more interesting piece is, as construction employers, what you do with this concept that it seems to be prevalent in the construction industry, but I don't see it on my job site, or I don't think we have that issue. So maybe a tougher decision for you, but I've given you my thoughts on what I think the safer approach is. So I'm not sure if there's any questions. I haven't been tracking that as we go, but happy to take something blinks up.
Yes, there are a bunch of questions about every single topic of Bill 88, so be ready. So regarding Section 4 of Bill 88, do you have any concerns about the doubling of the delay period for prosecutions?
Sorry, I'm just looking. Honestly, Ian, not something that I specifically have focused on. Be happy to chat about that offline. I do recognize you. I'd be happy to reach out and have a quick chat about that. I think there was.
I think you're muted, Ahid, because I think you were going to go through and ask
Yes.
the questions. Yeah,
Yes. Sorry, I was muted. Yeah. So about the right to disconnect, what happens if the size of the company fluctuates? So if I have 25 employees, let's say in June, July, August, and then in the next 9 months, for some reason, I don't have 25 employees anymore, where do I sit?
That's a great question. So it's always, for the purposes of determining whether or not you qualify as an employer, you're always looking at the January 1st date. So if it's as of January 1st of this year, you didn't have 25 or more, then you're waiting until January 1st of the next year to make that assessment once again. So it's very well possible that it's fluctuating. And you also want to keep in mind employees that may be part-time or on leaves of absence. Those employees are also captured for the purposes of determining whether or not you meet that 25 or more threshold.
Okay. Then, so regarding the fines, can you speak to the role of the company versus the role of the supervisor? So what are the employer's responsibility if there's a charge? So can someone else in the company pay the fine on behalf of the supervisor, or?
No.
No.
Short answer is no. And that's deliberately for the reason that they want to impose that personal responsibility. Now, how often do supervisors get individually named and charged? Not as often as the employer or the constructor themselves. Can that be a piece of discussions? I wouldn't call it negotiations, but discussions with the Crown leading up? Yes, it can. So, I think if I was myself a supervisor thinking about that situation, you need to recognize that personal liability is there. It is real. Something happens, I've yet to see the case where, but I'm not saying it couldn't happen, but I've yet to see the case where the employer or the business sort of turns their back and leaves the supervisor swinging in the wind. So there's typically a lot of support and cooperation there, but I also see, and this doesn't go against what I just said, but you also see circumstances where those individuals decide to retain their own lawyers, if apart from the company lawyer. But most often it's a concerted response and defense, and everyone cooperates in that sense. But strictly speaking, no, you shouldn't be sitting as an individual and assuming, oh, well, the company will just pay a fine if you have actual individual responsibility for something that you failed to do from a health and safety perspective that you should have known.
Yeah. Okay. And so to do with knowing like overdoses, what does it mean to be ought to be aware of a chance of an overdose? Like,
Yeah, that's a that's a very good question, and that's that's the eye rolling or sarcastic my comment about being somewhat sarcastic. I mean, that's a term of phrase you see in the law a lot.
mhm,
It's designed to give some flexibility. The point of it is, if someone was standing beside me and judged Brian's decision making or conduct in what they view the reasonable person. This person doesn't actually exist, but what do you think is reasonable in the circumstances? What would you expect a reasonable person to know or do, or sort of put two and two together to identify this as an issue? So what does that mean? It's a word salad. But I think that's why my comment is, so certainly if you and look, this is not something that's ever easy to admit, but if you have a work site where I'll put this in dark terms. You have a work site where there's a lot of drug talk, right? Or frankly, like you're very aware of the casual use of marijuana or something to that effect. You can have, I think, a work site culture, and that might not be anything reflective of your company. Clearly, there's an element of the industry itself that leads to this, at least demographically. Then something bad happens. That reasonable analysis is going to be from that sort of 20/20 hindsight kind of thing. And if it was decided that they wanted to do that, you might have workers who would now say, "Well, come on, everybody knew this was going on. Everyone knew Timmy had a problem." And they just turned a blind eye. So that's your worst case dark scenario, right? So I guess what I am saying is, having the kits there and complying with that requirement is the safer way to go, because you couldn't really be criticized if you're just saying, well, we don't think it's a problem with us, with our job sites, but the industry data suggests it might be. So we're going to decide that it'd be reasonable for us to do that. So that's your safer course of action. But strictly speaking, it's, as I said, it's not, they haven't gone to the extent of saying, quote unquote, construction sites must have an naloxone kit.
Okay. Then we have a question. Section 51 of the OSHA speaks to critical injury and death and require ML to be notified. Bill 88 speaks to serious injury. Is there a definition of serious injury?
Certainly critical injury, and you have, I don't want to call it a meat chart in terms of, loss of consciousness, fractures, that sort of thing. So I don't on the spot know the answer to that question, but those things typically have a definitional component to what is caught and what is not, although even in that critical injury section, it's not always that easy. Loss of consciousness and how much bleeding in it, how major is the bone that's broken and that sort of thing. Yeah.
And then a follow-up question to the fines one. Can an employer cover the legal costs of an employee? So if a supervisor has been fined and they're getting legal help, can an employer cover that?
I don't know that answer 100%. I believe they can, but I don't know that. So I wouldn't want to say for certain. Happy to have to figure that out though, if anyone wants to reach out.
Okay, and then I think
I won't turn the timer on and charge you for a simple question like that.
And then the last question, and it goes back to the risk they ought to have known. If I believe that I have a high risk on my site, whether it's because there's drug talk or any of that, does that open the door to mandatory testing? Could that open the door to mandatory testing?
Well, I mean, that's the classic drug testing question but so, I mean, there have been arbitral cases and there have been awards that have lowered that threat, because, this is where we get into the discussion about current impairment versus like, why do you care if they're doing drugs on their own time, but they're never impaired at work? It shouldn't really be your concern. And, what does drug testing tell us about current impairment? So it goes into that whole category. And generally speaking, then that's the cold water that gets poured on drug testing. But then, yes, there are exceptions. So, and rather famous ones, a TTC or others, for example, where there's proof of a pervasive substance abuse issue, and that can be, depending on the circumstances, rationale for drug testing. So in some certain narrow circumstances, that has been a justification. I don't know that this would necessarily go hand in hand. I think that, if it was as simple as, well, we've decided that, yes, there could be this real risk, and that's why we're doing things like introducing the naloxone kit. I don't think that's evidence that's going to get you very far in terms of now trying to justify drug testing. But I mean, it's an interesting question. I've not been asked that in specific reference to this naloxone piece. We can keep an eye on it and see what happens.
Perfect. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn this over to Amina, who will be leading us through the rest of the webinar.
Sure, maybe just one last question. And just to clarify, so the requirement to have a policy, disconnecting from work policy, applies to just direct employees or indirect employees as well?
So the answer would be, if I'm understanding direct correctly, the answer would be direct. So specifically any employees that an organization employs within Ontario, full-time, part-time, right? Like all your staff is, unless, are we talking about subcontractors or just to get a bit more context?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it would be specifically any direct employees of the organization that would be captured for that definition.
Okay, perfect. So thanks, Louisa and Brian, for that very informative presentation and answering all the questions. I'm sure there will be many more questions as the policies come into place. And our next presentation is from Mark Barnes, who is a pharmacist and the owner of Respect RX Pharmacies. Mark and his partner are passionate advocates for the respectful approach to substance misuse and mental health treatment. This led them to develop Respect RX, a chain of pharmacies that pride themselves on providing dignified, stigma-free pharmacy services to those with complex mental health and addiction issues. Further to this, Mark's work on the opioid crisis led him to develop and implement a fentanyl patch return program to help curb the diversion of this deadly drug to the streets. In 2015, this fentanyl patch for patch return program became Ontario law. Mark has received many awards over the years, including Alumni of the Year from Memorial University in Newfoundland and Disease Management Award from the National Commitment to Care Award, among many more. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks for having me. I really like that we did the legal thing first, because it actually speaks to the stigma that surrounds complex mental health, substance misuse in the construction sector. And I mean, you guys are really just reiterating why we have such a problem in this industry and in Ontario in general. There's a lack of awareness of the severity of the problem in and around opioid overdose, and why, though the inherent problem with this policy and the changes to Bill 88 may not happen at work, we have a responsibility to make sure that everyone comes back to work the next day healthy and happy. 1 in 3 opioid overdoses that happen in Ontario are among your brethren, your industry, right? So by bearing your head in the sand, say, after work, not my problem, it's not fixing the solution. We'll talk about that and why I'm such a passionate advocate for this. So with that, I'm going to share my screens and we'll get going here a little bit on my presentation. So first and foremost, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I don't take any opportunity to speak to this industry lightly. That's for certain. And that's something that I've been working with for the last 10 years. But certainly my work in the construction industry happened many, many years ago. Actually, when we first opened our first location dedicated to complex mental health and substance misuse back in 2012, 2013, we realized early that if you're going to have, a mental health and substance misuse focused practice, you better be open early, and you better be open every single day to support the construction sector. I may be the only pharmacist in the province with work boots and a hard hat, doing work on the construction sector. I've been doing it for a decade. My first involvement actually at a construction seminar was interesting. Our medical officer of health and the coroner's office asked me to go to a construction conference here in Ottawa to discuss opiate overdose and prevention of death with naloxone. When you roll into a construction conference as a pharmacist and a health professional, you stick out like a sore thumb. I'm not going to lie to you. You really do. You got your big site guys there. You've got your transportation guys. You got your crane guys. And then you've got pharmacists with some public health nurses trying to prevent overdose. Of course, the first question is like, dude, like, what are you doing here? Why are you at this conference? And I simply say, do you know that in this region, 1 in 3 overdoses are from the construction sector? Within 5 minutes, every single person had a story of someone they know they've lost or who's struggling. By the end of the conference, and this was back in 2020, by the end of the conference, I didn't stick out like a sore thumb. I actually had the busiest booth. This year coming up, post-COVID, I'm now at the same conference, but the keynote speaker. So you better listen up, because this isn't going away. And the Minister of Labor has made a fantastic decision to implement this policy, despite it being a problem or a pain in your butt. That's what it is. Now, why are we talking about opioids and why is it a problem? Okay, first and foremost, I'm going to speak on both sides of my mouth to give a little bit of background. I understand you're not health professionals, but opioids are not bad medications. They're not bad medications, and we cannot do modern medicine without them. And they're never going away. We can't escape it. But they should be reserved for advanced cancer pain or advanced acute pain, such as driving a nail gun through your foot, or, you know, to put you to sleep for surgery. Let's keep that in the back of our mind when we think about opioid overdose. Now, if I had to ask anybody here, you know, what's some famous prescription source opioids? You all would have said, hell, hydromorphone, morphine, codeine, OxyContin, Percocet, Tramadol, Tramacet. Now, if I go back to 2012, like even 10 years ago, 2010, 2012, 10 years ago, from a street source perspective, I had to ask everyone on the call today, you know, what's the most famous street source, bootleg, drug den, you know, made for the street, by the street, opioid? Probably everyone on the call would have said heroin, just like a lot of the gangster movies you would have watched on TV. If you advance to 2022 to today's, heroin is gone and it's been replaced with a nasty term, fentanyl. So this is street source, bootleg, drug den, made for the street, fentanyl. Different than the patch return and the fentanyl patches from pharmacy that was mentioned earlier in the intro. This stuff is fentanyl powder for the street, all various colors. And that's the main street sourced opioid that's out there right now. Why that is such a problem is that fentanyl is actually 100 times stronger than heroin per milligram strength, right? And during COVID-19, just like you guys have talked about, problems doing business, getting commodities, labor, shutting down things, COVID. Well, drug dealers on the streets can't make a consistent form of fentanyl either. It's hard for them to do business. So in essence, in Ontario, we have probably well over 200 forms of fentanyl out there. Most of them are as strong as arc fentanyl or carfentanil, which is 100 times stronger than heroin. So just in about a 10-year period, you have to understand, from 2012, 2010 to now, the toxic street drug supply of opioids in Ontario is now 10,000 times stronger than heroin per milligram strength. That poses a unique problem. Not only are people consuming opioids at copious amounts, more than we've ever seen before, we have a non-opioid street drug issue, where we're finding minute amounts of these opioids in all other street drugs. Don't care what the substance is: Molly, ecstasy, crystal meth, cocaine, crack, speed, anabolic steroids of gym, and even, wait for this, non-government supply street sourced cannabis can contain opioids. So my message is simple. I don't care what substance you're using. And this includes the substances that are most popular for construction, which is not an opioid, which is probably cocaine and cannabis, right? We are seeing overdoses in all these substances. So just assume whatever substance you see may contain opioids, carry naloxone, and never use that substance alone. And people often ask, Mark, you know, are you producing a lot of fear among this? And I'm not over exaggerating. Tara Gomes, a physician out of Toronto, did some testing on street drugs out there. She took about 1,400 stimulant doses off the streets in Toronto, did some testing, and she found, you know, fentanyl in about 4.4% of it, you know, 1 in 25 doses, enough for me to be concerned. Now, what is an opiate overdose? What's happening to the body? So you guys can recognize it, understand it, and be able to deal with it on your sites, in your industry, but with your homes. An opioid overdose, remember I mentioned we use high dose opioids to put you to sleep for surgery. Let's think about that process. Okay, it's time for your knee replacement. Count backwards from 10, 9, 8, 7. You're unconscious. Welcome to the wonderful world of opioid overdose. Really, the study of anesthesiology is putting you in an opioid overdose to do that knee replacement. Now, as soon as you lose consciousness, the first thing that a doctor will do is they'll intubate and ventilate. They'll hook you up to a machine to keep you breathing, because the opioids just don't kill pain and, you know, sedate. They also, you know, acutely stop breathing. So an opioid overdose, in a workplace, at home, after work, wherever, is you stop breathing. I tell kids it's equivalent to taking a plastic bag, placing it over your head and taping the neck. The immune receptors in the brain and spinal cord get saturated with the opioid. Your breathing's depressed, your brain gets hypoxic, and you die. That whole process is only about 5 minutes. So think about your construction sites. Think about how hard it is to get EMS to somebody who's accidentally consumed an opioid, right? Think about a tower with a temporary elevator or whatever. They're dead. So most people die in Ontario of an acute opioid overdose. 911's been called. Paramedics are en route, but they didn't have a tangible tool to keep them breathing until paramedics got there. And my paramedic friends that I play hockey with and stuff tell me, you know, Mark, we used to see opioid calls once every 2 weeks. Now we're seeing it twice a shift. The prevalence is insane. Let's look at that prevalence. I can show you Canadian statistics, but really let's keep it closer to home here. Look at the increase in opioid overdose deaths in the last few years. This is why the Minister of Labor has made this decision. What we're doing is not working. We have to stop this, right? You'll see a sharp increase from 2012, like I mentioned, on up to 2018, 2019. This was the introduction of fentanyl to the streets of Ontario. The deaths rose, tripled. You know, back in 2018, we lost 1,474 people to an opioid overdose death. At that time, the Ontario government really got concerned. They activated the emergency response system around the opioid crisis. Pools of money were poured into the industry, trying to prevent death. Simple. We put out naloxone, we talked about it. And I know you guys are kind of in the Toronto area, whatever, like or all over Ontario. Think about this. The Ontario government bought the most expensive 30 seconds of advertising in Ontario. You know, Saturday night hockey night in Canada, Toronto Maple Leaf playoff game, round 1, first intermission. 30-second ad, do not take opioids if you can. Never use it alone, carry naloxone. I almost fell off my chair. And it worked. We also know why they didn't choose round 2, Leafs fans, just saying. But listen, I'm telling you right now, guys, and then that information worked. That advertising, that talking about naloxone and the distribution worked. That's why we're doing it again. We flattened the curve. You'll see 2018, 2019, the death tolls didn't increase. Yeah, most regions in Canada decreased, but we actually, broke even here in Ontario. At least we started to get a handle on it. We started to tread water. But then you'll see a sharp increase again. We got absolutely, completely surprised by COVID-19. Fear, anxiety, isolation, access to cash, consistent cash, and CERB, I think led to more overdoses than we've ever seen before. It's continuing on the 2021 and 2022. In 2020, there was a 60% increase year over year. We're losing 1 Canadian now every hour, right? We're since 2016 in Canada, we've lost, well, really probably close to 35,000 Canadians, probably closer to 40,000 by the end of next year. These are COVID-sized numbers. Think about the billions spent on COVID. This is absolutely an epidemic happening in the face of a pandemic. So we got to start thinking outside the box. This is why I applaud the Minister of Labor for making this decision. Phenomenal. And we'll be digging out of this problem for the next 5 years. We'll probably be close to 3,000 deaths in Ontario for the next 5 years until we dig out of this. Here's a warning out of Sudbury talking about a product up there marketed as just THC Gold. So a really strong cannabis product. It wasn't. It contained fentanyl. People died, right? Now, the new Ontario legislation, as it's mentioned earlier, legally, we don't really know when it's coming or, how it's going to look. It's very vague. I do have a podcast taping with the Minister of Labor Management on July 5th. I'll keep you posted how that goes and a little bit more direction hopefully by then. But like I think the fall is a very good time frame for implementation of policies. If you want to know why construction is so overrepresented and why these 1 in 3 people overdose in the construction sector, there's a fantastic article written by Megan Kinch in Our Times Magazine from March 31st, 2022 that outlines why construction is so overrepresented. Remember, over 60% of people who overdose in Ontario are fully employed like you and me, right? And they're housed like you and me. It's not a homeless shelter problem. It's not an unemployment problem. It's an industry problem. It goes across many sections. And 1 in 3 of those people employed are construction. It is by far the largest overrepresented industry when they look at coroner's data, people who have died. So we have to protect our workers so they come back to work healthy. And I understand that potentially 1 in 100 will be at work. I get that. But you know what? Everyone's complaining about labor shortages now and the 300,000 skilled workforce we can't get and whatnot. How about we protect the workers we have so they come back to work healthy? How about we talk about conversations from health and safety directors about the problems that happen after work so people can, not be afraid to talk about it and get better to be a more efficient, effective worker the next day. Now, I mentioned we did the work back in 2018, 2019, and we did flatten the curve with naloxone, an overdose prevention tool. The best region in Ontario doing that was here in Ottawa with us. We did 38.1 kits per opioid harm, the largest in the province. When I asked our coroner's office about that data, though, because we still lost 64 people. Yeah, maybe it should have been more, but we still lost to 64. I asked them about that data, and I said, hey, of those 64 deaths, how often are you finding naloxone at the scene of a death? In other words, how often does the person have a chance to make it in the beginning? And they said, Mark, sadly, 1 in 4. And I said, oh, okay, so we've missed 3/4 and we're the best. Then how much more naloxone do we need to put out there to be more effective? And the answer is a hell of a lot more than we're doing now, thus these new policies that are coming. But when you look at who's really at risk of opioid poisoning, the medical literature wants you to focus on 3 main areas. The first area is not just fentanyl and illegal drugs and illicit drugs on the street. It's actually also opioid prescriptions. 1 in 3 people who die of an opioid overdose have an active prescription for the opioid at the time of death. Okay, 1 in 3. So it's not just street use, it's also prescription opioids. Now, how much prescription opioids do we put out there, right? Well, 13% of Ontario adults received an opioid prescription last year. That is a large number. We dispense over 100 million in Canada alone, 3 per person living. We are probably the epicenter of opiate prescribing on the planet, right? Now, here's a really sad statistic and why pharmacy probably is dropping the ball here and why it's pushed to industries like yourselves. Only 1.6 of opioid prescriptions that leave pharmacies are protected with that naloxone program from pharmacies with a naloxone kit. Very sad, right? Now, over 70% of all opioid use in general is for non-medical reasons. It's non-pain, non-sedation reasons. It's to turn off mental pain, and we'll talk about it. So because of that, we also have to protect the family and friends of people prescribed opioids. So those prescribed opioids, the family and friends of those prescribed opioids, and also a patient with a substance misuse issue. Those who identify as having a problem that cannot be, we cannot just tell people they're afraid to talk about it now. The stigma has to go away because the deaths won't until the stigma goes away. People cannot be afraid to disclose they have a problem as a fear of losing their job. That is a problem. That's a problem that I'm seeing from the people I treat every day. That's important to note. So we have to treat those patients with a substance misuse issue. But this doesn't tell the whole story because of a rich, young, white female, right? I'm not even sure legally if I'm allowed to say that. We have lawyers here, they can tell me, which is the lowest represented statistic in Canada of overdose death. Rolls out of a mansion and says, man, I've had a rough month, a really tough month. So I'm going to use some cocaine tonight because I do that once a month with my friends. The cocaine is laced with fentanyl and the kid dies. We've missed her in medical literature. She wasn't prescribed an opioid, nor were her friends and family, and she doesn't have a substance misuse issue. She uses cocaine once a month recreationally. Big deal. But she's still dead. She's still dead. We've missed her. So the patients that I treat from our centers, the 3,500 souls that we treat here in Ottawa, want me to bring this message to you guys forward, that we also have to have a street perspective around the opioid overdose crisis, which says pretty much because of the sheer amount of opioids that we have in our society in Ontario, so much so that you can actually test for opioids in wastewater. Anybody who does not have tolerance to an opioid is at risk of overdose. Now, you don't have tolerance to an opioid. If you weren't expecting to see one in your body, such as that girl who thought she was doing cocaine, but it was laced with fentanyl. Or how about somebody who only uses substances around check time when they get some cash and they poly use it, and they go up and down like this, they're at risk of overdose. And here's something from the construction sector I'll bring forth to you. I was doing a labor management kind of talk just like this not very long ago, last week, and a young fella disclosed to me that he works at the Boilermakers trade and he had a real bad injury. Okay, something exploded. He had lots of internal injuries. He got rehabbed, but through his rehab and his surgeries, he got on a high dose of opioids. Really busy guy, advanced to management in the construction sector, very proud of himself, worked hard. But because he was so busy, he couldn't get to a couple doctor's appointments. So he missed a couple doctor's appointments and didn't take his meds for a few days. On Friday afternoon, when he was off, he got access to his physician, got back on his medications as fast as he could. He took the exact same dose he was supposed to take as prescribed by his physician. His wife woke him up about 3 o'clock in the morning, screaming and punching him. He said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" She said, "I'm trying to wake you up. You had stopped breathing for 1.5 minutes on his regular opioid prescription because he hadn't taken it for a few days." That's the construction sector. That's a relevant prescription on an appropriate dose, and the person still overdosed. This is the real problem of opioids in Ontario. Other medical problems, breathing difficulties, COPD, asthma, also risk factors. Think about people who smoke. How many people in the construction sector smoke or have breathing difficulties? A lot. Using alone, again, we talked about it, is a big risk factor. The tool used to prevent overdose is naloxone. It cannot be used on yourself, right? It's intended to be used on somebody else. You're already prepped and ready for surgery as it was. And then a previous overdose of any substance is a future indicator of more overdoses. And what I want the construction sector to understand, and what I want you to bring from this presentation today, that people who use opioids or choose to use them, we heard about drug testing and some of the negative, I guess I get a negative feeling that people have to do this from this presentation today, is that opioid use disorder is not a character flaw. It's not a moral insufficiency or a social choice. People who choose to use opioids use them to kill pain because they're painkillers. I 100% agree with you. But in over 70% of the time, as proven by statistics, that pain isn't physical. The pain is mental. Of all the substances out there, the best drug at turning off the brain from trauma are opioids. So if you experience post-traumatic stress disorder from military service overseas, sexual assaults as a kid, abandonment, marriage troubles, financial difficulties, and you want to escape this mental anguish that's happening in your mind every single day for a few minutes a day, the best drug out there to do it are opioids. People describe how it makes them feel mentally in 3 main terms at our centers who are struggling. They'll describe it as their body's been filled with liquid caramel. They'll describe that they've been wrapped in a warm blanket, but the term used more often than not to describe how the opioid makes them feel mentally is a warm hug. Very powerful literature to describe how it makes them feel. The problem is where they want to go when they use that substance, especially if you have a mental health disorder, is they want to get to 2 breaths per minute. They're almost physically dead. That's when the trauma leaves them. And they'll go there 5 times a day until they get well. So 1 overdose is an indication that the person will have more and more until they get well. So we got to stop judging the overdoses and start preventing them by giving people the proper supports in the industry. That's the message from this today, using risk factors. And the drug that they choose to use now is stronger than ever, right? That's a 1-inch ruler on the right-hand side. This is Ontario's toxic drug supply. Those 2 vials of fentanyl and carfentanil depict what it takes for us to overdose. Okay, it is the size of a few grains of salt. You can't taste it, smell it, and see it. And those who, so it gets cross-contaminated and stuff. And those who choose to use it can't control what they're using anymore. Now, the signs and symptoms of opiate overdose are very distinctive. And I'll go over them with you. The first one is a decreased level of consciousness. And there's all kinds of industry stuff I can send you, PDFs, posters you can send with workplace health and safety areas, next to your first aid kits. There's all kinds of stuff I can send you in PDFs. But the first symptom is a decreased level of consciousness. Not a silly way to say you're prepped and ready for surgery. You can't be woken up even if I pinch or shake you. The next symptom is pinpoint pupils. Pupil is a black part of your eye. During an opiate overdose, you cannot even see the pupil. It's all you can see is the color part, the iris, okay? The pupil is almost non-existent. Then we see a deep snorting and gurgling sound. This is the body gasping for air without the mechanical ability to breathe. Same sound you make if I took my hands, placed them around your neck and choked you out. But there's no hands around your neck, and it gets louder and louder as time goes on. The lips start to turn blue, the fingertips turn blue, then the whole hands turn blue, the whole face turns blue. Blue is the color usually described in medical literature, but only really pertains to pale white people, right? We are a multicultural society in Canada. In my books, that's what makes Canada awesome. So we have a bunch of ethnicities. The darker the complexion, the more gray the color, right? So it's blue or gray. Then we start to see white cottage cheese foam around the mouth, and then the person starts to shake at the end. These are all the signs and symptoms of opioid overdose. You see any of them, you act with naloxone. Now, let me tell you a little bit about naloxone so you have a better picture of it. Yes, we mentioned injections or whatever, but for right now, for construction, for everyone's sites, for homes, really, it's Narcan nasal spray. Now, I said naloxone, I said Narcan. Naloxone is the generic name, like ibuprofen. Narcan is the brand name, like Advil. Narcan nasal spray. I like to think of this stuff here as the EpiPen for opioids, but it's just a nasal spray, okay? But like an EpiPen can't remove peanuts in the body, Narcan nasal spray cannot remove opioids in the body either. What it does, it temporarily goes into the bloodstream, okay, removes the opioid off that receptor in the breathing centers for a short time, allowing the body to breathe until paramedics get there. So now we have that tangible tool to keep someone breathing until paramedics get there. It is super stable. It doesn't expire until January 2025 right now. It's stable from -15 to +45. If it freezes, it's not garbage. It just has to be thawed. It thaws 15 minutes at room temperature, 10 minutes your hand. So make sure one is always warmed up. This is a fantastic addition to any first aid kit on a construction site. It only takes 2 to 4 minutes to start working, and the person can already be past breathing, be a non-breather, and it still works. And it's just a nasal spray. There's a lot of myths out there that if I give them Narcan, I'm going to get a violent person wake up and want to just fight me. And that's a misconception out there. They're pertaining to withdrawal, and that is bogus. It's media propaganda. Just like the opiate crisis is only caused by homeless people with needles in their arm from Vancouver. Again, media propaganda, right? First of all, if it's an accidental ingestion, like a cross-contamination, there's no tolerance, thus there's no withdrawal. Second of all, okay, the person doesn't go in withdrawal till an hour later. That's a paramedic issue, not a first responder issue. Now, will every single person wake up with agitation and anxiety? Yes. But we have to stop demonizing this. This is not acute withdrawal. This is a normal human response. Think about it, you're at a party. Someone gives you a drink. You take a sip, you wake up 7 minutes later with somebody pushing on your chest, doing CPR almost to break your ribs. Something has just recently been sprayed in your nose. Your friends and family are staying around you crying. And there's sirens in the background. Are you waking up? Best party ever? You're probably not. You're waking up with agitation, anxiety. That's a normal human response. And remember, this stuff does not last long. It only lasts 20 to 40 minutes. The person will slip back into overdose. It is a medical emergency. You must call 911. But do not be afraid to use it. There's a lot of people saying, hey, I'm not a trained medical professional. What if the blue lips was a heart attack or the shaking was a seizure and I got it wrong? It doesn't matter. Narcan nasal spray is the safest thing that I can dispense in a day. It's safer than Advil or Tylenol. It'll have no effect on someone who has not taken an opioid. It's completely inert. And it's fully endorsed by our Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act that says no one's in trouble for using Narcan, even in a failed attempt, or they got it wrong. And then no one's in trouble, even if they're using substances themselves. You must call 911. It's so important. Now, how we use it, there's a 5-step approach. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my share for 1 second, bring you to a website that I developed, naloxonecare.com, that shows you a 4-minute training video how to use a Narcan nasal spray. So this time I'll share with sound for video clips, bring you to the website and show you how to use a Narcan nasal spray. Here we go. If you can't see it or hear it in a couple seconds, please somebody scream at me. Sorry about that, a little bit delayed here. Here's the website and the video. In 2018, 1 Canadian died every 2 hours from an opioid overdose, and this number continues to rise. It's not just heroin or fentanyl users in the streets, it's grandmothers with their own prescriptions, and kids who didn't even know they took an opioid. My name is Mark Barnes. I'm a pharmacist and the owner of naloxonecare.com, an interactive website designed to allow more Canadians access to life-saving drug naloxone. Naloxone is the drug that's found in an easy-to-use Narcan nasal spray. It can reverse the effects of an opioid overdose in as quick as 2 to 3 minutes.
After you complete a simple training and answer a few questions on this website, we can send you a Narcan nasal spray kit directly to your home. So what are opioids? They are painkillers such as codeine, morphine, OxyContin, Percocet, and fentanyl. Recently, much stronger powdered fentanyl and carfentanil are leading to accidental use and overdose because they are so small and hard to detect if mixed with other drugs. With this Narcan nasal spray antidote, you can deliver 2 milligrams of naloxone directly to the bloodstream. Although naloxone can reverse the effect of an opioid overdose, it cannot remove the opioids from the body. It's important to call 911 after you administer the spray because in 20 to 40 minutes, the effects of naloxone will wear off and the person will slip back into overdose. The time it takes when an opioid is ingested to overdosing and death can be as quick as 3 to 5 minutes, which is why it's so important to recognize the symptoms quickly. Here are the 4 major symptoms of an overdose. Unconsciousness. The person is not moving and cannot be woken up, even if you shake or pinch them. Pinpoint pupils. The person's pupils are small and hard to detect. Snorting or gurgling sounds. The person can be heard gurgling or choking, and breathing is shallow or undetectable. Blue and gray lips. The person's lips turns blue or gray. Other symptoms include cold, clammy skin, foaming at the mouth, and shaking. Every naloxone kit you order from naloxonecare.com includes a case, latex-free vinyl gloves, a CPR mask, 2 doses of Narcan nasal spray, an identification card letting everyone know that you've been trained to use naloxone, and instructions. We like the 5-step approach to respond to an opiate overdose. Step 1, shake and shout. Assess the person and remember the major symptoms of an overdose. Step 2, call 911. If the person is unresponsive, call 911 right away. Step 3, administer the naloxone. Lay the person on their back. Remove the device from the packaging. There's only 1 dose per device, which is ready to use, so do not test or prime the device. Tilt the person's head back and provide support under their neck with your hand. Gently insert the tip of the nozzle into the nostril. Your fingers should be right up against the nose. If giving to a child, make sure the nozzle seals the nostril. Press the plunger firmly with your thumb to give the dose. Remove the device from the nostril. Step 4, chest compressions. Start CPR as it takes 2 to 3 minutes for naloxone to start working. If you have an AED, use it. If not, push on the center of the chest. This pushes any of the oxygen left in the body to the brain and circulates naloxone to the areas of the brain and lung to start working. Step 5, is it working? If you do not hear a deep breath in 2 to 3 minutes, then go back to step 3 and administer a 2nd dose of Narcan nasal spray found in your kit. Once the naloxone is actively working and the person is breathing on their own, put them in the recovery position. The recovery position helps open the person's airways and avoids choking on vomit or spit. Remember, naloxone only lasts 20 to 40 minutes, so an overdose can return. It's important to get the proper medical treatment. Tell paramedics everything you know about the situation so they can provide the best care. Get trained, get a kit, save a life. So that's the video right there, how to use a Narcan nasal spray that we developed for people who find going to pharmacies actually maybe not the best thing for them. So the other thing is, I'd be convinced to change my video a little bit. It's a little bit dated, but we have to wait for a little bit of policy changing from the Minister of Health. From that standpoint, though, we only study the effectiveness of naloxone in mortality and morbidity data, right? Hey, did you make it? Did you not make it? I get 2 calls per day at Public Health here of somebody using naloxone who actually made it, okay, yet have permanent medical damage. Maybe, most recently was the person who overdosed. They made it, they lived, but they now are missing a leg due to lack of oxygen and blood supply. So we got to get naloxone into the body as fast as possible, right? Every second matters. So my first 3 steps, which are assessment, 911, naloxone, are super quick. The assessment, who really cares? It's completely safe. But you're looking for pinpoint pupils, gurgling, blue-gray lips, and shaking. Step 2, 911, staff it out. Have someone call 911 for you, or put them on speakerphone on a cell phone, right? It also has a timer going, but do not wait for the 911 responder to tell you what to do. Just open your Narcan nasal spray and spray it. Like I mentioned in the video, there's a single-use device, already primed, ready to go. There it is there. You push the plunger in the middle. If you choose the left nostril,
twist towards the left eye. If you choose the right nostril, a little bit towards the right eye, and then spray it. Here in my office, I shot about 2.5 feet in the air. Inside the nose is coated with science. You'll see that the device has been cooked. It's a single-use device given. You've delivered naloxone. So 1, 2, and 3, 30 seconds. Step 4, of course, now you need to see if it's going to work, right? So we want to make sure it works as fast as possible. So how we make it work as fast as possible is by using an AED. We're starting normal CPR. During COVID-19, Public Health Ontario is recommending actually we don't do rescue breathing, but it's a loved one or friend that's normal CPR. And when you push on the chest for about 2 minutes, 1.5 to 2 minutes, that drives naloxone to the breathing centers where it needs to work. And when it kicks in, there's a sound heard that's heard in every single reversal. You hear this, a deep breath. If you do not hear that deep breath in about a minute and a half, the clinical picture is getting worse, more blue and gray, more shaking, gurgling, then it's getting louder. Grab another spray. So go spray, chest compression, spray, chest compression, spray, chest compression. You keep going in that rotation. You can't overdose on naloxone. You keep going. Until a paramedic tells you to stop, the person takes that deep breath and is doing better, right? Or you run out of naloxone, then it's just normal CPR. That is the new 5-step approach of how to use an Narcan nasal spray in the event of an acute opioid overdose. It's completely safe, it's easy to use, and a fantastic addition to every single first aid kit in Ontario, as far as I'm concerned. I'm going to share my slides again from the current slide just for a couple more resources. Getting naloxone in Ontario, like I said, there's community pharmacy programs all over the place. Embarrassing though, I have to say, of the 2,500 pharmacies in Ontario, they're giving out naloxone. They say they are. I mean, really, how many know what they're doing? I don't know. But 1.6% of opioid prescriptions are protected right now with a naloxone kit. Very embarrassing in my profession. So I put my email in there. If you want this training for your staff, friends, and family, please reach out to me or go to naloxonecare.com. You click on group training function at the top there. It talks. I'll be able to do this for your company or have someone do it for you. If you want to try to order an naloxone kit for those who see me present, you can click on the green button and we'll ship it to your house there. There's not many resources in and around opioid overdose prevention in the workforce yet. There are more to be developed by the Minister of Labor, I'm sure. I'll ask that question myself on July the 5th. There's one from CCSA, the Canadian Center on Substance Abuse, and there's another 12-minute podcast that's the link here from the Canadian Center of Occupational Health and Safety. This is a fantastic resource that we should be promoting in every single public space in Canada. It's something cool that came out of COVID. It's actually the National Overdose Response Service. I mentioned to you that using alone is a big risk factor. And one of the biggest increases during COVID, where we asked people to self-isolate and stay alone. Now they don't have to use alone. They can call a phone number or go onto the Brave app and be in contact with someone. If they don't respond back in a few minutes, they'll actually send EMS to the location of the cell phone. Very cool thing that happened out of COVID. The last thing I say that I want you to take from this presentation today is ask not why the addiction, but why the pain. An important message for the construction sector. Okay, with that, I'll stop my share and turn over to any questions.
Thanks, Mark. We do have a few questions. One of them was on the training video that you shared with us. Would that first, are people able to use that training video and circulate it within their networks, within their staff? And then would that be, by taking that training video, would that be considered fully trained to use or administer Narcan or naloxone?
The answer is we don't know. The answer from the Minister of Health is yes, that's enough training. They think the training piece is wonderful. Yeah, they do. They think it's sufficient training on how to use the Narcan nasal spray, 100%. They have no problem with the education piece. They want you to be connected, though, with a local pharmacy when possible. That being said, I understand how frustrating it is. I'm willing to offer this hour-long seminar to everybody in the construction sector who I can get in contact with. And then you can, for those who can't attend, you can tape the session like on a Zoom chat like this and share with the people who are not there. I find that to be a more effective way. One of my feedbacks to the Minister of Labor thus far with this is that if you make this a point and click type online learning like WHMIS, it'll lose its effectiveness and you will not get the passion about stigma that's leading to the problem in the first place. The traditional forms of preventing overdose in our country it's not working. We have to think of new solutions. And I think understanding the stigma and being able to ask questions about your own personal experiences is so valuable. So I would encourage everyone to have a live virtual presentation.
And there's another question, I believe you answered it, but just to confirm, if you're trained to administer naloxone, or maybe you're not, but you happen to have a kid and you're around someone who is, looks like they're overdosing.
Yeah.
There's, just confirming, there's no legal fallout if
No.
something goes wrong.
No, it is covered by the Good Samaritan Drug Overdose Act. Yeah.
Okay.
There's never been a paramedic called to testify in a drug trial or an overdose death ever. It just doesn't happen.
Okay. And then is there a fee for these kits and the training?
It's actually right now, we don't know what that looks like for the Minister of Labor side of things. So Minister of Health, if you are a breathing Homo sapien in Ontario, you're allowed to have a naloxone kit and there's no restriction on the numbers, right? Like there's no restriction. I can give you 2 kits for every day you're living, right? Like it doesn't matter. You can be anonymous, which is your other interesting piece. I don't agree with the anonymity of this because I'm thinking you should be passionate to have this. People who carry naloxone should be deemed people savers, not drug users, right? But that being said, I understand the stigma in around substance misuse. I'm not naive to this. So if you want to walk into a pharmacy and remain completely anonymous, you can actually get kits and walk out without even telling them who you are.
And I know, I think it was a couple summers ago, there was an EpiPen shortage. And now with, I imagine with the Bill 88, there may be more demand for naloxone kits. Do you foresee there being like a supply issue?
I pose that question to the makers, the Emergent Biosolutions. Now, I'm not sure. I'm a unique individual. I think I've got more naloxone in my 5 pharmacies than 1,681 Shoppers Drug Marts across Canada. This is who I am. Passionate advocate for this, right? I asked the makers. I don't anticipate a shortage. I've asked them about this. They don't anticipate a shortage.
Okay. And then just a couple questions. I know you spoke about where like fentanyl can show up in, I think it was like when you're getting prescribed drugs, including like Oxy.
Well, Oxy is an opioid, right?
Right. So that's obviously still an issue.
Yes.
And would you classify it as a mental health issue, so substance misuse, or is it just, okay, I got injured on site and now I'm using it more?
So here's an example of how I'll describe this in a way through an example. First of all, we can't predict substance misuse. We can't. I can't look at you and say, oh no, your blood work came back, you got 4 substance misuse, you're going to be addicted to this stuff. Like it doesn't work that way. It's more of a social kind of screening that we do, about risk of substance misuse. It's a screening. It's more of a conversation with health professionals. It's a very complicated process to be able to identify that. But every single human is susceptible to it. Okay, and that's just the way it is. My friend recently had a hip replacement. Young fella, 45 years old, to have a hip replacement, and he was an international sales guy. Very complicated job. Does a lot of international travel. It was COVID. Had a lot of worries about money, his job, and his daughter just came out, young daughter came out as being transgender. A lot of stress changes in his life that he was stressed about. A lot of mental stress. He had the hip replacement. The hip replacement happened. He got prescribed hydromorphone, a prescription opioid for pain. I walked into his house 2 days after surgery with a raised toilet seat and a walker for the guy so he can get around his house. When I walked in the door, he threw the bottle of hydromorphone at me. And I said, whoa, Tim, what's going on? He said, Brian, you talk about this stuff. Like you talk about it. But he said, until you take it, I had no idea. He said, I took the hydromorphone, but not only was my hip pain gone, I didn't worry about anything. My life was awesome. I didn't care about the family, money, anything. My brain was turned off from trauma. That's how quick it happens. So if you have an injury in a workplace, you're worried about a job, you're worried about your company, whatever. It's a way to turn off that brain. And that is the piece that's the mental health issue.
And so again, related to that, if I'm prescribed an opioid for whatever reason, what is the best practice or tips to avoid addiction or overdose?
To use it exactly as directed. When you experience that, I don't care about anything, recognize that, hey, I think I'm not taking this for pain anymore. I'm taking this for other reasons. Reducing the supply. So, hey, when you get 30 prescribed by a doctor, say, I'll take 10 now. If I need more, I'll come back and get them. Gives you a second interaction with a pharmacist or a physician to talk about that. And always ask for naloxone.
And there was a couple questions earlier, or just comments about proper storage. And I know you alluded to the temperature being an important factor in being able to administer it properly or for its full effectiveness.
Really, it's pretty, pretty robust. It's minus 15 to plus 45, almost every temperature range in Canada for many months of the year. And the few little times that's, except for the guys super north, that's below minus 15, just keep one warmed up, right? Like if you can do work, you're not working in less than minus 15. Very few trades do. And even then, keep it on your body, right? That's like police officers do. They keep it on their body, keep it warm. Keep in the truck. If it's in the truck overnight, no problem. Put it up on the dashboard on your way to work, that kind of things, right? It's things we can do, but don't let the temperature range be a reason why not to carry it. Also, don't let the temperature be a concern, right? Just make sure one's always warmed up. And even if it does freeze, it's not garbage, right? We know that it goes through a freeze thaw cycle with stability. You just got to warm it up.
And then just to confirm, because I know you mentioned that there were some textbook signs of someone who may be experiencing an overdose. And part of it was if you have blue discoloration, but if you maybe don't have lighter skin, that might not show up as much. What are some of the other signs?
So it's pinpoint pupils, gurgling, blue and gray lips, shaking. It's not really a vomiting, but the guys get like a white cottage cheese foam around the mouth and they're completely unconscious, cannot be woken up, right? They're out. And really, if you look at someone who's unconscious, you hear that gurgle getting louder and louder and louder. It's very distinctive. Now, sometimes at a loud construction site, it make it hard to hear, right? But it gets louder and louder and the lips are starting to turn blue. And you see a white cottage cheese foam around the mouth, you can assume it's an opiate overdose.
And this is one last question, I think, unless there were any more, but are there any specific signs of, because we will have this requirement to have naloxone kits, and you ought to have known, or if you have any if you suspect it, are there any signs other than, people are talking about it on site, what they did on the weekend, what they did after work, that they may have used drugs or maybe even overdosed over the weekend, like after the fact?
Well, the whole industry is high risk as far as I'm concerned. I know the labor lawyers might disagree with me, but just based on my profession and what I see, anybody in the construction sector is at risk. There's one study out of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, so PSAC, that says maybe 1 in 4 of his whole membership may have a substance misuse issue. That's a large number in Canada. When you look at actual sites, if you see drug paraphernalia, guys talk about partying the night before, guys come in asking to be paid early, guys only show up around payday. There's all kinds of trends that you can see that way. I don't like to talk much about that because it's a lot of stigma. I prefer to protect the whole industry and say anyone can be at risk. Even an injury with a prescribed medication could be a risk. That's why I think that we kind of got to stop thinking about the old TV stigma around drug use and look at the whole population in general, realizing that a lot of it can be hidden quite well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think there are any more questions. Personally, this has really made me want to just go to Shoppers or my local pharmacy and just carry one around.
Well, I can guarantee you from anyone in the organizer of this call, if you want to give me, if you want to collect everyone's address and phone number, I can actually send you 2 kits directly in the mail from us. We FedEx them all over the country, actually, with a bunch of national programs we're up to, but certainly I can do that for anyone in call today. Absolutely fine. If someone wants to collect it from the organizers of this webinar, that we can actually do that. I'll actually protect the whole industry here.
Yeah, no, that would be great. And I certainly think that most of the attendees will want your contact information following this presentation.
Sure.
Just to
No problem.
follow up. But I'll turn it over to Andrew now to give some closing remarks. But thanks again, Mark. That was
My
really
pleasure.
great.
Yeah, thank you. And first off, just want to thank you, Mark. So instead of giving gifts or saying thank you to speakers, we like to make a donation. And so based on your presentation, we're assuming somewhere that we can make a donation. I don't know if it's to the cause where you're sending out kits or wherever you think it's appropriate. We'd love to make a donation in lieu of a thank you to you and to Brian and Louisa.
Absolutely, I would love that. Actually, I have a fantastic organization that would be happy to help.
Absolutely. And then we're going to do a survey for everyone who was registered and attended today. And so obviously one of the questions that we'll put in that survey is contact information. And we'd be happy to try and help facilitate getting some of these kits out. But, just first off, thank you to Brian, thank you to Lisa, thank you to you, Mark. At ResCon and with our work with Orca and, that coalition of subtrades that we pulled together, we really rely on good speakers and professionals. And so thank you to Brian, Louisa, and Mark, because it makes, our lives easy because we just get the good speakers and you guys do what you do. I probably have the easiest time because I get to work with Ahed and Amina, and they're the ones that, as everybody knows, does the real work. So thank you to them as well, and all the people that help put these on. So just as, some concluding remarks, I think we view this as a start. And so we've been focused on mental health. We're going to continue to do mental health conferences at least once a year. But I think what we're seeing a lot, and I think what everybody's seeing in the construction industry, is you really can't isolate mental health to one event. It really impacts everything. And here we are talking about Bill 88, working for workers. And, the big theme in it is obviously mental health, right? I think another part of it is, as we continue to evolve, as we come out of the pandemic, and certainly during COVID, what you do at home impacts what you do at the workplace. Well, that again applies when you're looking at opioids and overdoses and different things like that. And obviously, there is a strong signal from the various levels of government where we need to be thinking not just about what happens at the workplace, but also what happens on the way to, on the way home, and what happens at home. And we represent a lot of unionized builders. And so we have to work with the various parties, whether it's, labor, government, and the more that the three of our groups can work together, the better it is for, our employees, union members, and, the citizens of Ontario. So our focus is going to continue going forward. We're going to continue to work with groups like IHSA. I have to give a shout out to Dean, who recommended Mark. So thank you very much for that. But we need to focus on implementation. We need to focus on data. We need to understand what's going on, and we need to know what we can do about it. And we're going to continue to do that. And then, as I said, we're going to be reaching out. We're going to provide a recording of the webinar. We'll make available the presentations that the speakers deem to be available. And we're also going to send out a survey as well, because this kind of is a new area. It's a new category. We've gotten close to it, but we haven't done what we did today. And so the more feedback we can get, the more adjustments we can make, and the better service we can provide through ResCon and Orca and our partners in the future. But with that, thank you one last time. And thank you to everyone who attended.